The year is 1776. In Edinburgh, a shy and soft-spoken man finally does something he has been building toward for 10 years. He hands his manuscript to his publisher. He has written it mostly alone in his mother's house, far from the world. He never married. He avoided cameras, well, portraits. He was, by every account, deeply unremarkable to look at. And yet what he carried in those pages that day would reshape the entire world. His name is Adam Smith, and almost everything you think you know about him is only half the story. By the time this story ends, you will understand every side of Adam. Along the way, we'll discover that the famous line everyone quotes from his book was never meant to mean what the world believes it means. We'll uncover how, for more than 200 years, the wrong people have claimed him as their hero. And we'll see why almost every politician who has ever quoted Adam Smith has misunderstood what he was truly saying. Most people think Adam Smith was simply the man who said greed is good, but that is not what he said, not even close. The real Adam Smith spent his life arguing that human beings care deeply about each other, and that any economy that forgets this is built on a lie. If stories like these bring you comfort, please subscribe to our channel where new biographies await you here each week. And I'm genuinely curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. Rest now. Let the world outside grow quiet. There is a small town on Scotland's eastern coast, and the year is 1723, and the sea is cold and gray, and a child is about to be born without a father. This is the history documentary of Adam Smith. Chapter 1. The Son Without a Father. Kirkcaldy, Scotland, June 1723. A small windy town on the coast. Fishing boats, salt pans. A long street running alongside the sea. Nothing particularly special about it. Nothing that would make you think, this is where it all begins. But it does. In the early summer of 1723, a boy is born into this town without a father. His father, a lawyer, a customs official, a man of some importance in Kirkcaldy, had died 5 months earlier. He never saw his son, he never held him, and his son never knew what it felt like to have him in the room. His mother, Margaret, raised him alone. She was strong, educated, and she did not fall apart. She kept the house running. She kept her eyes on the boy, and the boy kept his eyes on everything else. The street, the neighbors, the ships coming and going, the way the whole town moved like a single living thing. He was quiet. He was sickly. He had no brothers, no father, just his mother, the house, and the sea at the end of the garden. And then one day, someone took him. He was 3, maybe 4 years old, when a group of travelers passing through the countryside grabbed him and carried him off. His uncle chased them down the road and brought him back, unharmed. It was later said with a smile that Adam Smith would have made a very poor gypsy. He would have. Even at 3 years old, he was not built for the open road. He was built for one place, one routine, one window looking out at the water. He would spend his entire life returning to exactly that, to his mother's house, to Kirkcaldy, to the sea, as if something in him never fully left. His mother gave him what she could: stability, attention, the quiet example of a woman who kept going when she had every reason to stop. And he absorbed all of it, not as lessons, but as something deeper, as the ground he stood on. Years later, he would open his first great book with a sentence that sounded like philosophy, but was really something more personal. He wrote that no matter how selfish we think people are, there is something inside every human being that genuinely cares about others. Something that finds real pleasure in seeing other people happy. A boy with no father. A mother who never gave up. a small, cold town by the sea. The question that would drive his entire life was already forming, even if he was still too young to ask it. What makes us care for one another? Soon, he would begin looking for the answer. But first, there was school, and a teacher who would change the direction of everything. Chapter 2. The Strange Small World of Kirkcaldy. Kirkcaldy, 1723-1737. Kirkcaldy was not a glamorous place to grow up. It was a working town, coal, salt, linen, nails, built along a single long street beside the sea. But if you stood in the right spot on a clear morning, you could see Edinburgh across the water, close enough to see, too far to touch. For a curious boy with nowhere particular to go, that view was its own kind of lesson. The world existed. It was just not here yet. School was a 2-room building, a short walk from his mother's house. Adam was a quiet student, not the kind who raises his hand constantly or performs for the teacher, the kind who reads everything, finishes early, and then keeps reading. His teachers noticed. His mother noticed. In a town of 1,500 people, word gets around about a boy like that. But the real classroom was the town itself. Kirkcaldy's nail-making workshops were everywhere, dozens of workers, each doing one small piece of the job. One man cutting the wire, another shaping the head, another finishing the point. None of them making a complete nail on their own. All of them together making thousands. A boy watching this every afternoon was watching something that would become one of the most famous ideas in the history of economics, the division of labor, without either of them knowing it. He was just a boy looking out the window. But he was the right boy, looking at the right thing. Scotland in those years was a country with a wound that hadn't healed. The Act of Union with England in 1707 had taken away the Scottish Parliament and folded Scotland into Britain. Many Scots felt they had been absorbed rather than united. There was anger. There were uprisings. The last one, Culloden, 1746, would happen when Adam was in his 20s, close enough to feel real. The Scotland he grew up in was proud, poor, and quietly furious about both. These things get into a child without him realizing it. The questions that would drive Adam Smith's entire career: why are some nations rich and others poor? Who really benefits from trade? What does a government owe its people? Were not ideas he discovered in a library. They were things he felt growing up in a country that believed it had been cheated. And always, underneath everything, the sea. There is something the sea does to a person who grows up beside it. It keeps going. It does not offer conclusions. It just stretches out to the horizon and reminds you every single day that the world is larger than whatever you are currently thinking about. Smith would spend his life building big ideas, systems, theories, arguments that tried to explain how human societies work. But he always left the edges open, always admitted what he did not know. The sea, perhaps, had something to do with that. He left for Glasgow at 14. He took nothing dramatic with him, just sharp eyes, a head full of questions, and the memory of those nail makers working away in the workshops along the high street. In Glasgow, someone was waiting who would finally give those questions a name. Chapter 3. Glasgow and the Greatest Teacher. Glasgow, 1737-1740. Adam Smith arrived at the University of Glasgow at 14 years old. Young, yes, but not unusually so for the time. What was unusual was the boy himself, quiet, watchful, already carrying questions that most people his age had not yet thought to ask. Glasgow was different from anything he had known. The university was alive in a way Kirkcaldy never was. Not louder exactly, but charged. Students argued in the courtyards. Ideas collided in the hallways. For a boy who had spent his childhood reading alone by the sea, it must have felt like finally arriving somewhere. The man who made it feel that way was Francis Hutcheson. Hutcheson was everything a philosopher was not supposed to be. He was warm, he was funny. He lectured without notes, in plain English instead of Latin, and he treated his students like people who were capable of thinking, not just absorbing. Students showed up early to his classes. They stayed after. They walked home still arguing about what he had said. What he taught them was simple and radical at the same time. Human beings, Hutcheson said, are not naturally selfish. We are born with something inside us that genuinely cares about others, a moral instinct, a pleasure in doing good, a natural pull toward kindness. Virtue is not a rule imposed from outside. It comes from within. It is part of who we are. Smith listened carefully, and then quietly he started to push back. Not against the idea itself. He would spend his whole life arguing that people are more than just selfish, but against the explanation. Saying humans have a moral sense is not really an explanation. It is just a name. The real question, the harder question, is where that sense comes from. How does it develop? How does it work? What actually happens inside a person when they make a moral judgment? Hutcheson gave Smith the question. He did not give him the answer, and that turned out to be the greatest gift a teacher can give. That question, how do humans develop moral judgment, became the engine of Smith's first great book, written nearly 20 years later. The best teachers do not hand you conclusions. They hand you problems worth spending a lifetime on. Smith left Glasgow in 1740 with a scholarship to Oxford. He was 17. He had spent 3 years in the most intellectually alive place he had ever been, under a man who showed him that ideas could be warm, practical, and deeply human. He would remember that lesson. Years later, in his own classroom, he would teach without notes in plain English to students who came early and stayed late, just like Hutcheson. But first came Oxford. And Oxford was going to teach him something completely different, and in a completely different way. Chapter 4. The Years at Oxford, or the Education in What Not to Do. Oxford, 1740-1746. He arrived at Balliol College in the summer of 1740, 17 years old, carrying a Snell Exhibition scholarship and the reasonable expectation that he was about to receive the finest education in the English-speaking world. Oxford was ancient, magnificent, and self-satisfied. Its stone buildings radiated the particular confidence of an institution that had never seriously doubted its own importance. The libraries were extraordinary. The gardens were immaculate. The professors, almost without exception, had stopped teaching. Not informally, not in a quiet, gradual way that might be forgiven. They had stopped teaching as a matter of settled institutional practice, collecting their salaries, attending the occasional ceremony, and otherwise leaving their students entirely to their own devices. Smith would later write, with a precision that suggested personal experience rather than general observation, that the professors of Oxford had given up altogether even the pretense of teaching. The word pretense is doing considerable work in that sentence. He was not describing neglect. He was describing performance, the maintenance of an appearance of education from which all actual education had been quietly removed. The reason was structural, and Smith understood it completely. Oxford's professors were paid whether or not they taught. Their income did not depend on the quality or even the existence of their instruction. The incentive to teach, to prepare, to engage, to improve, had been severed from the reward for teaching, and the result was exactly what any honest observer of human nature would predict. Men who are paid regardless of their efforts will, over time, reduce those efforts towards zero. This was not a moral failing unique to the scholars of Oxford. It was a feature of the system they inhabited. Change the incentives, and you change the behavior. Leave the incentives broken, and the institution decays from within, while its facade remains perfectly intact. This was not yet a theory. It was an experience, felt daily across 6 long years. What Smith did, in the absence of anyone to teach him, was read. He read voraciously and without direction. French literature, English poetry, classical history, philosophy, political thought. He taught himself what the professors would not. And somewhere in those long, solitary afternoons in the Bodleian, surrounded by books and institutional failure, a habit of mind was forming that would prove more valuable than any curriculum Oxford might have offered. The habit of tracing every observable phenomenon back to its structural cause. Why do these men not teach? Not because they are lazy by nature, but because the system rewards them for not teaching. Why does a pin factory produce more pins than a craftsman working alone? Not because the workers are more talented, but because the structure of the work has been arranged to make them more productive. Why do merchants lobby governments for monopolies? Not because they are uniquely corrupt, but because the system makes monopoly profitable. Always the same question, always the same method. What is the structure that produces this behavior? Oxford gave him the question by failing to answer it about itself. There was one other thing those years provided, quieter and more personal. Away from Kirkcaldy, for the first time in any real sense, away from his mother's house and the familiar rhythms of the Firth, Smith discovered what he was like when entirely alone. The answer, it seems, was perfectly content. He did not seek out the social life of the college. He did not form the lasting friendships that Oxford often produces. He read, he thought, and he wrote. Early fragments of essays, careful observations, the beginnings of a system not yet visible even to himself. He left Oxford in 1746 with no degree worth speaking of, an extensive self-made education in European literature, and a contempt for institutional corruption that would sharpen over the following decades into some of the most precise and devastating criticism of economic privilege ever written. The worst years of his education had taught him more than the best ones. He was heading home now, back to Scotland, back toward his mother, back toward the sea. He did not yet know that the most important friendship of his life was waiting for him there. Chapter 5. The Edinburgh Lectures and the Encounter with Hume. Edinburgh, 1748-1751. Edinburgh in the late 1740s was a city in the middle of becoming something it could not yet name. The old town climbed its ridge in layers of gray stone and compressed ambition, tenements stacked 6 and 7 stories high, their stairwells shared by lawyers and fishwives, professors and tavern keepers, all of them crowded together in a vertical intimacy that produced, among other things, an unusually democratic intellectual culture. Ideas moved quickly here. Arguments started in a tavern and continued in a drawing room, and were still unresolved by morning. The city was small enough that everyone who mattered knew everyone else, and large enough that the conversations never quite stopped. Smith arrived back in Scotland in 1746, 23 years old, Oxford behind him, his future entirely unresolved. He had no academic post, no income, and no clear path. What he had was the reputation of a man who could think carefully and speak clearly, a reputation built on nothing more than the memory of his Glasgow years and the quiet word of people who had noticed him. It was, in the 18th century, sometimes enough. In 1748, through the patronage of Lord Kames, a Scottish judge and philosopher, who collected promising young minds the way other men collected paintings, Smith was invited to deliver a series of public lectures in Edinburgh. The subject was rhetoric and belles lettres. The audience was composed of Edinburgh's professional class, lawyers, physicians, merchants, men of affairs who wanted the polish of learning without the inconvenience of a university education. Smith gave them more than polish. His lectures were organized, precise, and unexpectedly alive. He argued that good writing was not ornament, but clarity, that the highest style was the one that placed the right words in the right order, with the least possible waste. He talked about literature, about language, about the way ideas take shape in sentences. But underneath the literary surface, something else was happening. Smith was developing a method, a way of taking human behavior apart and examining its components, a way of asking not just what people do, but why the structures around them make them do it. The lectures were well received. He delivered them again the following year and the year after that. Edinburgh was beginning to know his name. And then there was Hume. David Hume was 37 when Smith returned to Scotland, and already the most controversial mind in the country. He had published his Treatise of Human Nature at 28, his essays shortly after, and his inquiries, and had been passed over for university positions at both Edinburgh and Glasgow on the grounds that his philosophy was dangerous to Christian belief. He had been called an atheist so many times that the label had begun to fit him like a coat he'd stopped bothering to remove. He was also, by all accounts, the warmest, most generous, most genuinely cheerful man in any room he entered, a fact that disconcerted his critics considerably. The two men met around 1749 or 1750. The precise occasion is not recorded. What is recorded, in the 56 surviving letters between them, and in the testimony of everyone who knew them both, is what followed, a friendship of such intellectual depth and personal warmth that it shaped everything both men wrote for the rest of their lives. They were not alike. Hume was expansive, sociable, openly skeptical of religion, comfortable with controversy, and constitutionally incapable of anxiety. Smith was reserved, methodical, privately doubtful about many of the same things, but unwilling to say so publicly, more careful of his reputation, and perhaps more careful, too, of his mother's feelings. Hume wrote prolifically and in every direction. Smith wrote slowly, revised endlessly, and published only twice in his lifetime. But the differences were precisely what made the friendship productive. Hume challenged Smith to be braver. Smith steadied Hume with his methodical patience. Hume showed Smith how far a philosophical argument could be pushed. Smith showed Hume, gently, persistently, where he thought the argument had been pushed too far. They argued about sympathy, about justice, about the role of religion in moral life. They read each other's manuscripts. They recommended each other's work to publishers. Hume sometimes chided Smith for writing so rarely and so slowly. Smith, one imagines, smiled and continued at his own pace. Rest for a moment in what this friendship was. At its beginning, two men in a northern city, in the years just after a failed rebellion, had reminded Scotland how precarious its position remained, finding in each other the one person capable of following their thinking wherever it led. It was, by any measure, the most important relationship of Smith's intellectual life, and it was only just beginning. In Glasgow, a chair was waiting. Chapter 6. The Professor of Moral Philosophy. Glasgow, 1751–1764. He was appointed Chair of Logic at the University of Glasgow in 1751 and Chair of Moral Philosophy the following year. He was 28 years old. The university that had first opened his mind under Hutcheson now handed him a room of his own, a salary, and the responsibility of filling both with something worth the attention of young men who had come a long way to listen. He did not take the responsibility lightly. Smith lectured without notes, following in this the example Hutcheson had set a decade earlier. He spoke in plain English, in full sentences, with the kind of careful organization that made complicated ideas feel, in the moment of hearing them, almost inevitable. His students remembered him as a man who seemed to think aloud in front of them, not performing conclusions, but arriving at them visibly in real time. John Miller, one of his most gifted students and later a distinguished jurist himself, recalled that Smith's lectures ranged across natural theology, ethics, jurisprudence, and economics in that order, and that each subject illuminated the others in ways that no single discipline could achieve alone. The classroom suited him completely. There was something about the obligation to explain that forced Smith's thinking into its sharpest form. An idea that survives only on the page, in private, is an idea that has not yet been tested, an idea that must be spoken aloud to real people who will ask questions and furrow their brows and look unconvinced, is an idea that has to earn its place. Smith's 13 years at Glasgow were years of continuous, rigorous testing, of his arguments against the intelligence of his students, of his conclusions against the friction of weekly repetition. The lectures on moral philosophy became, slowly and then deliberately, a book. He had been thinking about the central problem for years, since Hutcheson, perhaps since Oxford, perhaps since Kirkcaldy. The problem was this: human beings are capable of genuine moral judgment. We know, most of the time, what is right and what is wrong. We feel it. But where does that feeling come from? Not from God dictating rules, as the Orthodox insisted. Not from pure reason, as some philosophers claimed. Not from an innate moral sense, as Hutcheson had argued. That was a name for the phenomenon, not an explanation of it. Smith's answer, worked out in lecture after lecture across those 13 years, was sympathy. Not sentiment, not pity, not kindness in the ordinary sense, but something more precise and more powerful. The capacity to place ourselves imaginatively inside another person's experience, to feel, however imperfectly, what they feel. To judge our own behavior by asking how it would appear to an impartial observer, a fair witness, neither our enemy nor our closest friend, who sees us clearly and judges honestly. He called this figure the impartial spectator, and it was, quietly, one of the most original ideas in the history of moral philosophy. In 1759, the lectures became The Theory of Moral Sentiments. It was published in London, sold by Andrew Miller, and received with an enthusiasm that surprised almost everyone except, perhaps, David Hume, who had been reading the manuscript and knew exactly what it was. Europe agreed. Voltaire is said to have called it the finest work of moral philosophy he had encountered. Catherine the Great had it read aloud at court. Edmund Burke praised it in print. Bishops approved of it, which prompted Hume's famous teasing letter, noting, with barely concealed amusement, that episcopal approval might not be the most reassuring endorsement for a work of true philosophical depth. Smith almost certainly laughed. He was happy in Glasgow. He said so plainly, in one of the rare moments when he spoke about his own life without deflection, calling these years the most useful, the most honorable, the happiest of his life. And then, someone made him an offer that took him away from all of it. Chapter 7. The Theory of Sympathy. It's Glasgow in 1759. The book arrived in the world in the spring of 1759, and the world, to a degree that surprised even its author, paid attention. The Theory of Moral Sentiments was not a short book, nor an easy one. It made no concessions to fashion. It did not flatter its readers or tell them what they already believed. It opened with a sentence that was, in the context of its time, quietly radical. How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. That sentence is worth sitting with. In an age that had grown accustomed to arguments about human nature running in two directions, either toward Hobbes's war of all against all, or toward the comforting pieties of religious morality, Smith was proposing something stranger and more interesting than either. He was saying, look at what people actually do, watch them carefully, and what you will find, if you watch honestly enough, is not pure selfishness and not pure virtue, but something more complicated and more human than both. What you will find is sympathy, not sympathy in the loose modern sense of feeling sorry for someone. Smith meant something more precise, the capacity to enter imaginatively into another person's experience, to reconstruct their feelings from the inside, to feel something of what they feel not because we are naturally good, but because we are naturally social. We cannot help it. We are built for it. When we watch a man stub his toe, our own foot flinches. When we see someone humiliated, something in us contracts. This is not virtue. It is the raw material from which virtue is constructed. The mechanism Smith described was elegant and unsettling in equal measure. We do not simply feel what others feel, we judge it. We ask unconsciously and constantly whether their emotions are proportionate, appropriate, admirable. And in asking that question about others, we inevitably turn it on ourselves. We begin to see ourselves as others see us, to measure our own feelings and actions against the standard of an imagined observer who is neither our enemy nor our devoted friend, but something harder and more useful, a fair witness, the impartial spectator. The internalized judge we carry everywhere, the voice that tells us when we have gone too far, when our anger is excessive, when our grief has become self-indulgent, when our pride has curdled into vanity. Smith argued that this internal figure, constructed from thousands of social encounters, refined across a lifetime of watching and being watched, was the actual mechanism of moral life, not God. Not reason alone, not instinct. A social process, invisible and continuous, by which human beings shape each other into something capable of living together. It was, Hume recognized immediately, a significant achievement. He had left his own account of sympathy somewhat underdeveloped, had gestured at it without fully inhabiting it. Smith had taken the idea and built an entire architecture around it. Hume wrote from London, where he was overseeing the printing of his own work, with news of the book's reception, and could not resist adding, in the playful tone their friendship had established, that several bishops had expressed warm approval of the theory of moral sentiments. Smith could draw his own conclusions, Hume implied, about what such approval revealed. The joke contained a genuine observation. The bishops had approved because the book seemed, on its surface, to support conventional morality, to confirm that human beings were social, sympathetic creatures capable of genuine virtue. What they had perhaps not fully noticed was that Smith had constructed this entire moral edifice without requiring God to hold it up. Morality, in Smith's account, was a human achievement. It emerged from our nature as social beings, not from divine command. The impartial spectator owed nothing to theology. Smith said nothing publicly to correct the bishop's impression. He was, in this, as in most things, careful. He had watched what had happened to Hume's reputation when religious controversy attached itself to a man's name, and he had drawn his conclusions. But he revised the theory of moral sentiments 6 times across his life. The last revision completed just months before his death in 1790. And in that final edition, the references to religion were quietly, methodically reduced. The bishops, had they noticed, might have revised their approval. Chapter 8. The Tutoring Years in France. France and Switzerland, 1764-1766. The offer came in 1763, and it was, by any practical measure, extraordinary. Charles Townshend, politician, wit, stepfather to the young Henry Scott, 3rd Duke of Buccleuch, wanted a tutor for his charge. The Duke was 18, wealthy beyond ordinary reckoning, and about to embark on the grand tour of Europe that was considered, among the British aristocracy, the final stage of a proper education. Townshend wanted someone of genuine intellectual distinction to accompany him. The terms he offered Smith were remarkable. An annual salary of £300, nearly double his Glasgow professorship, plus all traveling expenses, and a pension of £300 a year for the rest of Smith's life thereafter. Smith resigned his Glasgow chair and left for France in early 1764. It was the longest he had ever been from home. It would remain so. They traveled first to Paris, then settled for 18 months in Toulouse, a prosperous provincial city in the south of France, where, Smith confessed in a letter to Hume, the society was pleasant, but the intellectual stimulation was, by his standards, close to non-existent. He was bored in the particular way that very active minds are bored, not lazily, but restlessly, with a growing pressure behind the eyes. To combat it, he told Hume, he had begun writing a book. He did not say what kind of book. He did not need to. Hume, who had been watching Smith's thinking develop for 15 years, could have made a reasonable guess. After Toulouse came Geneva, and Geneva meant Voltaire. Smith had admired Voltaire for years, had assigned his work, argued about it with students, quoted it in lectures. The meeting, when it came, seems to have confirmed, rather than complicated, his estimation. Voltaire was in his early 70s by then, sharp and sardonic and enormously alive, holding court at his estate at Ferney with the practiced ease of a man who had survived exile, censorship, and the sustained disapproval of the French state, and emerged from all of it more famous than when he started. Smith, who had spent his career being careful about what he said in public, must have found something clarifying in Voltaire's absolute refusal of caution. Then came Paris, and Paris changed everything. Hume was in Paris ahead of him, serving as secretary to the British Embassy and occupying, with characteristic good humor, a position of extraordinary social celebrity. The French intellectual world had decided that Hume was the greatest philosopher alive, and it treated him accordingly, with dinner invitations, salon appearances, and an intensity of admiring attention that Hume found both flattering and faintly exhausting. He introduced Smith into this world, and the doors that opened were remarkable. Smith met d'Alembert, co-editor of the great Encyclopédie. The monument of French Enlightenment thought that attempted to organize all human knowledge into a single rational system. He met Helvetius, who believed that human beings were entirely shaped by their environment, and that education could make them anything. He met Turgot, the economist and statesman who would later attempt, and fail, to reform the French fiscal system before the Revolution made reform irrelevant. And he met François Quesnay. Quesnay was the intellectual leader of the physiocrats, a school of economic thought that held, with systematic conviction, that all real wealth derived from agriculture. Manufacturing and trade were, in the physiocrat view, essentially sterile activities, moving value around without creating it. The land was the source. Everything else was circulation. Smith disagreed, profoundly, methodically, and with the particular patience of a man who has been thinking about the same problem for years and finally has someone worth disagreeing with. The physiocrats had asked the right question: what is the source of national wealth? And arrived, he believed, at a dramatically incomplete answer. Labor was the source. Not just agricultural labor, but all labor, organized intelligently, divided carefully, freed from the artificial constraints of mercantilist policy. The nation that understood this would prosper. The nation that protected its merchants at the expense of its workers and its consumers would decay. The conversations in Paris sharpened what had been forming in Toulouse. The book became more specific, more ambitious, more argumentative. There is some evidence, not certain but plausible, that Smith also met Benjamin Franklin during these years, and that he showed Franklin portions of his manuscript. Franklin was in Europe as a colonial representative, already famous for his electrical experiments and his political acuity, and already troubled by the growing tension between the American colonies and the British Crown. Whether or not they discussed the manuscript directly, Smith's thinking about taxation, representation, and the relationship between colonies and empire was developing in ways that would prove, within a decade, urgently relevant. The French years ended abruptly. The Duke's younger brother, who had joined them in Toulouse, fell suddenly and seriously ill. Smith nursed him through it, watching, helpless and distressed, as the young man declined despite everything that could be done. He died. Smith and the Duke returned immediately to London. The grand tour finished without ceremony, the mood of the whole enterprise altered permanently by grief. Smith spent the following months in London, widening his circle to include Edmund Burke and Edward Gibbon. Then, in late 1767, he turned north. He was going home. Back to Kirkcaldy, back to his mother's house, back to the long garden that ran down to the shore. He was carrying with him 3 years of conversations, arguments, disagreements, and observations that had transformed the book he was writing from a critique of mercantilism into something far larger. The sea was waiting, and so was the work. Chapter 9. The Decade of Silence. Kirkcaldy, 1767-1776. He moved back into his mother's house. He was 44 years old, pensioned, celebrated, and entirely content to disappear. The man who had dined with Voltaire, argued with the physiocrats, and moved through the brightest intellectual salons of Paris, returned to a fishing town of 1,500 people and a childhood bedroom with a view of the Firth of Forth, and seems to have felt, in doing so, not diminishment, but relief. The years that followed were years of almost total seclusion. Smith rarely traveled. He received occasional visitors. Hume made the short journey from Edinburgh, and there were others, but for the most part his world contracted to the house, the garden, the shore, and the manuscript. He dictated to a secretary for long stretches, then revised alone, then dictated again. The work was slow and deliberate and total. He gave it everything. Margaret was there. The two of them settled into the rhythms of a household that had always, at its center, been just the two of them, a widow and her son, organized around quiet, around work, around the particular companionship of two people who have known each other long enough that speech is often unnecessary. What Smith was building in those years was not a tract. It was not a pamphlet for merchants or a manual for legislators, though it would eventually serve both purposes. It was a philosophical history of how human societies organize themselves to produce and distribute wealth, and why the arrangements most countries had chosen were, by the evidence of history and the logic of human nature, spectacularly wrong. Mercantilism, the dominant economic doctrine of the age, held that national wealth consisted in the accumulation of gold and silver, that exports should be maximized and imports minimized, that the proper role of government was to protect domestic merchants from foreign competition. Smith found this not merely mistaken, but morally backward. It protected the powerful at the expense of the poor. It confused the interests of merchants with the interests of nations. It treated the consumer, the ordinary person buying bread and cloth and tools, as an afterthought when the consumer was, in fact, the entire point. The alternative he was constructing was both simpler and more radical. Wealth was not gold. Wealth was the annual productive labor of a nation's people, and that productive labor flourished best when it was free. Free to divide, to specialize, to respond to the genuine signals of demand rather than the artificial signals of government protection. Outside the house in Kirkcaldy, history was accelerating. The tensions between Britain and the American colonies were sharpening toward crisis. In 1773, tea was thrown into Boston Harbor. In 1775, the first shots of a revolution were fired. Smith watched all of it from his study, incorporated it into his thinking, revised his chapters on colonies and taxation with the particular attention of a man who understands that theory and event are, at certain moments, the same thing. He finished the manuscript in London, where he had gone for a final stretch of revision in 1773. By early 1776, it was ready. He was 52 years old. The sea was gray and cold behind him. The world was about to hear from him. Chapter 10. The Wealth of Nations. Edinburgh and London, 1776. It was published on the 9th of March, 1776, in 2 volumes, by the London firm of Strahan and Cadell. The full title was An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. It ran to nearly 1,000 pages. It cost £1 16. It sold out its first edition in 6 months. The opening is one of the most famous in the history of ideas, and it is worth remembering what Smith chose to begin with. Not gold, not trade, not the mechanics of markets, but a pin factory. 10 workers, each performing one small specialized task, producing 48,000 pins a day. One worker, attempting the whole process alone, might manage 20. The mathematics were simple. The implication was vast. The wealth of nations did not come from the accumulation of precious metals, or from the protection of favored merchants, or from any of the machinery of mercantilist doctrine that had governed economic policy for 2 centuries. It came from the organization of human labor, from the decision, made millions of times across millions of workshops, to divide a task into its smallest components and let each person do one thing well. Everything else in the book grew from that image. Smith dismantled mercantilism not as an abstraction, but as a living system with identifiable beneficiaries and identifiable victims. The beneficiaries were merchants and manufacturers, the people with the money, the connections, and the political access to shape legislation in their favor. The victims were everyone else, the workers whose wages were suppressed by monopoly arrangements, the consumers who paid artificially inflated prices, the colonies stripped of the right to trade freely with whoever offered the best terms. Smith wrote about merchants with a controlled contempt that is one of the quiet pleasures of the book, noting that their interests were never exactly the same with that of the public, and that they had a tendency to deceive and even to oppress the people they claimed to serve. This was not a celebration of commerce. It was a moral argument about who commerce was supposed to serve. And then there was the invisible hand. It appears once, a single time, in the middle of Book 4, in a specific argument about why domestic investors tend to prefer home markets over foreign ones. Smith's point was modest and precise. A merchant who invests locally, intending only his own security and profit, inadvertently supports the domestic economy more than if he had invested abroad. He is, as Smith put it, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. The phrase was not a theory of markets. It was not a slogan for unlimited free enterprise. It was a quiet observation about one specific tendency in one specific type of economic behavior, that it became, in the following 2 centuries, the defining metaphor of capitalism, the philosophical foundation of laissez-faire economics, the intellectual weapon of a Cold War, the banner under which entire political movements marched, would have puzzled its author considerably. The phrase appears 3 times in all of Smith's writing, across very different contexts. He seems to have regarded it as a minor rhetorical flourish, not a grand theory. History had other plans for it. Hume read the book from his deathbed. He was dying of what was likely intestinal cancer, and he knew it, and he had made his peace with it in the characteristically cheerful way that would soon become the most controversial thing about him. He wrote to Smith with quiet confidence, predicting with the accuracy that genuine understanding produces that the book would take time to find its full audience, but that its depth and solidity would ensure it eventually would. He was right about both things. It was one of the last letters he wrote. Outside, in the same year, the American colonies were drafting a Declaration of Independence from a system of imperial taxation that Smith had spent 1,000 pages arguing was unjust. The year 1776 had more than one revolution in it. Chapter 11. The year everything changed. It's Edinburgh in 1776. 3 things happened in 1776 that belong together, though history has rarely placed them in the same frame. In March, The Wealth of Nations was published. In July, the American colonies declared their independence from a system of imperial taxation and commercial control that Smith had spent a decade arguing was unjust to everyone it touched, the colonies included. And in August, David Hume died. The first 2 events have been written about, debated, and celebrated for 2.5 centuries. Entire libraries exist on the wealth of nations. Entire nations were built on the Declaration of Independence. The third event, a man dying quietly in Edinburgh in late summer, has no library, no monument, no national holiday attached to it. But for Adam Smith, it was the one that mattered most. They had been friends for nearly 30 years. 30 years of letters, dinners, arguments, manuscripts passed back and forth across the table, ideas tested against each other until they either held or broke. 30 years of Hume's teasing and Smith's patience. 30 years of the kind of friendship that does not need to announce itself because it is simply the background against which everything else happens. Hume had been ill for months, and Smith had known it. The illness had started quietly. A digestive complaint, the doctors said, manageable at first, then less so. By early 1776, it was clear that manageable was no longer the right word. Smith had traveled to meet his friend at Morpeth, on the road south, earlier that year. He had seen it himself, the thinner face, the slower step, the body that was visibly giving way. And yet, what struck Smith, standing there on that road, was not the decline. It was the calm. Hume was dying, and he knew it, and he was, there is no better word for it, fine. Not performing fineness, not pretending for the sake of the people around him, actually, genuinely, bewilderingly at peace. This was not what dying was supposed to look like. Not in 1776, not for a man widely regarded as an atheist in a deeply religious society. The accepted understanding was clear. A man who had spent his life questioning God, who had written skeptically about miracles and the afterlife and the foundations of religious belief, should face death with the terror that only faith could prevent. His end should be a warning, a lesson, a demonstration of what happened to those who strayed too far from the church. Hume declined to perform this lesson. He spent his final months at his house in Edinburgh doing what he had always done. He read Lucian's Dialogues of the Dead, among other things, which he found both amusing and philosophically interesting. He received visitors. He revised his essays for a new edition. He joked about whether Charon, the mythological ferryman who carried souls across the river to the underworld, might grant him a little extra time to see how his ideas fared with posterity. His friends came away from his sick room shaken, not by grief, though there was grief, but by the strangeness of watching a man face the end of everything with such complete and unperformed equanimity. He ate well when he could. He slept. He talked. He laughed. Smith visited him again as the summer deepened and the illness worsened. He sat with him. He listened. He watched the man who had been the finest intelligence of his generation grow quieter and slower, and still entirely himself, curious, warm, sharp, unafraid. Hume died on the 25th of August, 1776. Smith received the news by letter from Hume's doctor, Joseph Black. The letter was brief and factual. Hume had expired the previous afternoon at 4 o'clock. The end had been peaceful. Smith sat with this for a long time. The loss was not abstract, the way the loss of a famous person can sometimes feel abstract, even to those who knew them. This was the loss of the specific voice, the specific laugh, the specific quality of attention that Hume brought to every conversation. The way he could take a complicated idea apart and put it back together in half the words and twice the clarity. This was the loss of the one person who had read everything Smith had written and understood all of it, who had followed the argument from the earliest Glasgow lectures through the long years of the theory of moral sentiments into the final shape of the wealth of nations, who had pushed back when pushing back was warranted. And Hume pushed back without ego, without cruelty, simply because he thought Smith was wrong about something and said so directly, who had praised without flattery, which is rarer and more valuable than it sounds. He was also simply the person whose company Smith valued most in the world. They had disagreed about things, about sympathy, about justice, about religion, about how far a philosophical argument should be pushed before it became reckless. Smith had always been more cautious than Hume, more careful of his reputation, more protective of the boundaries between what he believed privately and what he was willing to say in public. Hume had sometimes found this frustrating. Smith had sometimes found Hume's fearlessness alarming. And none of it had mattered in the end. because the friendship was larger than the disagreements. It always had been. Smith sat down and wrote. The letter he composed to the publisher William Strahan, describing Hume's final weeks, his character, his courage, his extraordinary cheerfulness in the face of death, was careful, measured, and completely uncompromising. It described exactly what Smith had witnessed. It did not soften the edges. It did not add a last-minute conversion or a deathbed prayer or any of the comforting narrative furniture that the reading public might have expected and wanted. It described a man who had died as he had lived, without religion, without fear, and with a grace that Smith found, in his precise and considered words, approaching as nearly as possible to the idea of a perfectly wise and virtuous man. He knew what he was doing. He had watched what religious controversy had done to Hume's career across 30 years. He knew the reaction this letter would provoke. He sent it anyway. It was the only piece of writing, apart from his 2 books, that Adam Smith ever published under his own name. 3 pages, 1 friend, 1 honest account of 1 death. It would bring him more trouble than anything else he ever wrote. More trouble, he would later say, than the wealth of nations itself, more than his attack on the entire commercial system of Britain, more than his arguments against monopoly and mercantilism and the power of merchants over governments. 3 pages about a dying friend. 10 times more fury than 1,000 pages of economics. He had not expected otherwise, and he did not regret it. The next chapter of his life was about to be considerably quieter, but not, it turned out, without its own particular ironies. Chapter 12, 10 times more abuse. Edinburgh, 1776-1777. The letter was published in March 1777, alongside Hume's brief autobiography, My Own Life. It was short, a few pages, and written in Smith's characteristic prose, measured, warm, precise, with the careful understatement of a man who knows exactly what he is saying and has chosen every word deliberately. What it described was a man who had faced death without religion and without fear. Hume had spent his final weeks cheerful, engaged, and entirely at peace, reading, receiving friends, revising his essays, joking about whether Charon, the mythological ferryman of the dead, might grant him a little more time to see how his ideas fared with the public. Smith reported all of this without apology or qualification. And at the end of the letter, he wrote the sentence that ignited everything. His friend, Smith declared, had approached as nearly to the idea of a perfectly wise and virtuous man as perhaps the nature of human frailty will permit. The reaction was immediate and ferocious. To call an atheist, and Hume was widely regarded as one, whatever the precise theological nuances of his private beliefs, a nearly perfect example of wisdom and virtue was not, in 1777, a philosophical observation. It was a provocation. It struck at the foundational claim of Orthodox Christianity that genuine virtue was impossible without faith, that a life lived outside the church was a life necessarily diminished, that a good death required God. Smith had not merely disagreed with this claim. He had produced a witness, a named, specific, recently deceased human being, whose final weeks constituted a direct empirical refutation of it. The letters of complaint arrived in quantity. Clergymen denounced the piece from pulpits. Reviewers called it dangerous. Private correspondents wrote to Smith with the particular intensity of people whose deepest certainties have been quietly threatened. Smith did not retract a word. He responded to the controversy with the same equanimity he had described in Hume, acknowledging the reaction, declining to be moved by it, continuing quietly with his life. He later remarked, with the dry precision that was his natural register, that the letter to Strahan had brought upon him 10 times more abuse than the very violent attack I had made upon the whole commercial system of Great Britain. The comparison is worth holding. The Wealth of Nations had challenged the economic arrangements of an empire, had argued in nearly 1,000 carefully reasoned pages that the entire mercantilist system was unjust, inefficient, and built on the systematic deception of the public by merchants and manufacturers. That had generated criticism, debate, and some hostility. The letter about Hume's death, 3 pages long, praising one man's courage, had generated 10 times the fury. What this tells us about 1777 is worth considering. Economic arguments, however radical, could be absorbed into existing frameworks of debate. They could be dismissed, qualified, or argued against. But Smith's portrait of Hume attacked something more defended and more personal: the belief that moral excellence required religious faith, that the good life and the faithful life were the same thing. Smith had argued in the theory of moral sentiments that morality was a human achievement built from sympathy and social practice rather than divine command. The letter to Strahan was, in its quiet way, a demonstration. Here was the evidence. Here was the man. Here was what virtue without theology actually looked like. He had practiced, in public and at personal cost, exactly what he had theorized. The bishops, one imagines, did not send a second letter of approval. Chapter 13. The Customs Commissioner. Edinburgh, 1778-1790. In 1778, Adam Smith was appointed Commissioner of Customs for Scotland. The salary was £600 a year, substantial, secure, entirely unconnected to intellectual production. He moved to Edinburgh, to a house on the Canongate called Panmure House, a modest but dignified stone building a short walk from the palace of Holyrood House, in the oldest part of the city. He brought his mother. He brought his cousin, Janet Douglas, who kept the household, and he settled, at 54 years old, into the quietest chapter of his life. The appointment was not without irony, and Smith was not a man who missed irony. He had spent years arguing in print and in lecture that customs duties were among the more pernicious instruments of mercantilist policy, artificial barriers to trade that protected the profits of merchants at the expense of consumers and the nation at large. He had devoted considerable space in the Wealth of Nations to the argument that smuggling, in the face of unjust and economically irrational legislation, was a morally understandable response. The smuggler who evaded an arbitrary tax, Smith had written, was a man who would have been, in any other respect, an excellent citizen. He was now one of the men responsible for prosecuting exactly such citizens. He appears to have found this neither distressing nor particularly difficult to reconcile. Smith's argument had never been against customs enforcement as such. It had been against the economic philosophy that made certain customs duties unjust in the first place. The law was what it was. His job was to administer it conscientiously, and he did. Contemporary accounts describe him as thorough, fair, and unremarkable in his official capacity, a bureaucrat of quiet competence who attended his duties without drama and without complaint. He was also, in these years, attending something else. Panmure House became, in the Edinburgh of the late 1770s and 1780s, something between a salon and a regular dinner gathering. Sunday suppers at Smith's table drew the best minds of the Scottish Enlightenment, the chemist Joseph Black, the geologist James Hutton, the philosopher Dugald Stewart, and a rotating cast of visitors from London, Europe, and the American states, whose independence Smith had quietly welcomed as a confirmation of everything he had argued about the injustice of imperial commercial policy. The food, by contemporary account, was good. The conversation was better. Smith was a generous host, and an unusual one. He was famously absent-minded in ways that had become, over the years, something between a personal characteristic and a public legend. Stories accumulated around him the way they accumulate around people who are genuinely elsewhere in their minds, even when physically present. He was said to have walked 15 miles in his dressing gown, lost in thought, before noticing where he was. He had a habit of talking to himself in the street, which Edinburgh's residents had learned to regard with affectionate tolerance. Once, showing a guest around a tanning factory, he fell into a tanning pit while gesturing at something he found intellectually interesting. He emerged, reportedly, still talking. His mother was aging. She had been the fixed point of his life for 50 years, the person he returned to, the presence that organized his domestic world, the woman whose company he had sought across every major transition of his adult life. She died in 1784, at the age of 90, and Smith's grief was quiet and total in the way that the loss of a long familiar thing is sometimes harder than the loss of a dramatic one. There were no scenes. There were no recorded last words of great significance. There was simply the house without her and the adjustment that followed. He threw himself into revision, the 6th and final edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. The book he had always considered his more important work, the book the world had largely set aside in favor of its more famous companion, was prepared in these years with the particular intensity of a man who knows he is running out of time to say what he means. He reduced the religious references. He sharpened the passages on the impartial spectator. He added new material on the corruption of moral feeling by wealth and status, on the dangerous human tendency to admire the rich, not for their virtue, but for their money, to confuse prosperity with goodness, to mistake the appearance of success for the thing itself. This edition was not incidental. It was in the context of everything that was already being done with his other book. The selective readings, the convenient quotations, the merchants and politicians who were finding in the wealth of nations, a justification for arrangements Smith had explicitly criticized, a quiet act of correction. He could not control how the wealth of nations was being read, but he could return to the theory of moral sentiments and make it, one last time, as clear as he was capable of making it. The two books belonged together. He had always known this. The system was not complete without both of them, without the argument that human beings were capable of genuine moral feeling, that markets required that moral feeling to function justly, that self-interest was not the foundation of a good society, but one element within a larger moral ecology that sympathy built and sustained. He was running out of time to say it loudly enough. In 1787, he was appointed Lord Rector of the University of Glasgow, the institution he had called the happiest place of his life, returning the honor 36 years after he had left it. He accepted with genuine pleasure. 3 years later, he would be gone. But first, there was the matter of the fire. Chapter 14. The Burning of the Papers. It's Edinburgh in 1790. He had been planning it for years, not the dying, though by the summer of 1790 that too was clearly close. The illness that had troubled him for months, showing no signs of retreat and every sign of conclusion. What Smith had been planning, with the same methodical patience he brought to everything, was the destruction of his unfinished work. A few weeks before his death, he summoned two of his closest friends in Edinburgh, the chemist Joseph Black and the geologist James Hutton, both men of rigorous intellectual honesty, both men who understood what he was asking and why. He had them come to Panmure House. He showed them what remained of a lifetime of thinking that had never made it into finished form. 16 volumes of manuscript, lecture notes, drafts, fragments, the accumulated working material of 50 years of philosophy, and he asked them to burn it. They did. What went into that fire has been the subject of scholarly mourning ever since. The most significant loss, by general agreement, was the unfinished work on jurisprudence, the third great book that Smith had promised. In the pages of the theory of moral sentiments, he would one day write. The system he had described required 3 parts: a theory of moral sentiments, a theory of political economy, and a theory of justice and law. He had published 2. The third existed only in fragments, in student lecture notes transcribed without his supervision, in the outline of an argument whose conclusion he had carried in his head for decades and never managed to set down to his own satisfaction. He could not release it unfinished. This was not false modesty. It was something more principled and more costly. The conviction that an incomplete argument was worse than no argument at all, that a system with a missing part was not a partial system, but a misleading one, that to publish something he had not perfected would be to leave behind not a foundation, but a ruin. The standard he held himself to was the same standard that had made him revise the theory of moral sentiments 6 times across 30 years. The same standard that had kept him in his mother's house for a decade, working and reworking a manuscript that lesser men would have published in the first year. The same standard that had produced, in the end, 2 books that earned their place on any shelf in any century. But it also produced the fire. There is a particular grief in this. Not Smith's grief, which the documents do not record, but the grief of the system itself. He had spent his life arguing that human beings were moral creatures capable of genuine justice, that sympathy and the impartial spectator were the foundations of ethical life, and that a full account of how societies should be organized required not just an economic theory, but a theory of law. The Wealth of Nations. Without the jurisprudence book is, in a very real sense, a conversation with one voice missing. The arguments about property, about justice, about what governments owe their citizens, they are present in the Wealth of Nations, touched on and then left, waiting for the book that never came. What survived the fire was spare. Some essays on philosophical subjects, the history of astronomy, the history of ancient physics, published posthumously in 1795 as essays on philosophical subjects. Student notes from the Glasgow lectures, discovered much later, that gave scholars a partial glimpse of what the jurisprudence course had contained. Fragments, shadows of a system. He died on the 17th of July, 1790, at Panmure House, after a painful illness. He was 67 years old. He was buried in the Canongate Kirkyard, a short walk from the house, beneath a simple stone that named him as the author of The Wealth of Nations. He had, by his own account, wished he had done more. Chapter 15. The First Misreadings. The distortion began almost immediately, not maliciously, at least not always, but with the particular efficiency of ideas that arrive at the right moment to serve existing interests. The Wealth of Nations was published into a world that needed it to mean something specific. Merchants needed it to mean that free trade justified their profits. Politicians needed it to mean that government interference in commerce was philosophically indefensible. The rising manufacturing class of Britain needed it to mean that the pursuit of private gain was not merely acceptable, but morally ordained. Each group found what it needed and read around the rest. What they read around was considerable. Smith had written plainly that merchants and manufacturers were inclined to deceive and even oppress the public. He had argued that the division of labor, carried too far, produced workers who were as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human being to become, and that this was a social catastrophe requiring public remedy. He had supported progressive taxation, universal public education funded by the state, and public works that private capital would never build because profit alone could not justify them. He had argued that the wages of the poor were the truest measure of national prosperity, that a nation where the laboring classes lived well was more genuinely wealthy than one where a small class had accumulated great fortunes. These passages did not disappear. They were simply set aside, quietly, repeatedly, across decades of selective quotation, while the passages about free markets and the invisible hand were elevated, repeated, and eventually enshrined. The process had its own logic. The Wealth of Nations was a long book, densely argued, full of qualifications and historical digressions and careful distinctions that resisted easy summary. What survived in popular circulation was what could be compressed into a sentence or a slogan. Free trade good, government interference bad, self-interest leads to public benefit, the invisible hand provides. None of these were false exactly. All of them were incomplete. Smith had been clear that self-interest produced public benefit only under specific structural conditions: competitive markets, honest prices, the absence of monopoly, the protection of workers from the organized power of employers. Remove those conditions, and the invisible hand became, as one later critic put it with more accuracy than he perhaps intended, the hand of a pickpocket. The irony ran deep. The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The book that provided the moral framework within which the Wealth of Nations made sense faded steadily from public attention across the early 19th century. By the time David Ricardo and later Karl Marx were building their economic systems on Smith's foundations, the moral philosopher had been largely separated from the economist. The man who had opened his first book with a sentence about our natural concern for others was being remembered almost exclusively for what he had written about self-interest. Smith had anticipated this kind of distortion, at least in general terms. He had written carefully about the tendency of powerful interests to shape public understanding in their favor. He had named the mechanism. He had described the disease. He simply had not imagined that the disease would use his own name as its cure. The larger misreading was still coming. Chapter 16. The Cold War Resurrection. For most of the century and a half following Smith's death, the invisible hand was a minor phrase in a long book. Economists read The Wealth of Nations carefully, quoted it selectively, argued about its implications, but no one had yet extracted a single metaphor and built an entire ideology around it. The phrase appeared occasionally in academic writing. It did not appear on campaign posters or in presidential speeches. It had not yet become a doctrine. Then came the Cold War. The confrontation between Western capitalism and Soviet communism required, among other things, an intellectual foundation. Central planning needed a philosophical opponent of equivalent stature. The economists who stepped forward to provide one, Paul Samuelson at MIT, Milton Friedman at Chicago, Friedrich Hayek in Vienna and London, needed a founding figure, a patron saint whose authority could anchor their arguments in something older and weightier than the immediate political crisis. They chose Adam Smith, and they chose, above everything else, the invisible hand. Samuelson's Economics, first published in 1948 and used as the standard introductory textbook in universities across the Western world for decades afterward, placed the invisible hand at the center of market theory, elevating a passing metaphor into a foundational principle, transforming Smith's modest observation about domestic investment into a general law of market behavior. What Smith had written carefully and specifically, Samuelson's textbook rendered universal. What had been a minor flourish in Book 4 became the organizing idea of an entire discipline. Friedman went further. In his public arguments, his television appearances, his enormously influential book, Free to Choose, he invoked Smith as the philosophical foundation of a vision of capitalism that was leaner, harder, and more absolute than anything Smith had actually written. The qualifications were gone. The warnings about merchants were gone. The support for public education and progressive taxation was gone. What remained was a Smith stripped to his most convenient essence, the prophet of self-interest, the enemy of government, the man who had proven, 2 centuries in advance, that markets were always right. By the time Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were invoking free market principles in the 1980s, the transformation was complete. Adam Smith had become a political icon, his face printed on ties and coffee mugs and the occasional banknote, his name invoked in budget debates and trade negotiations, his ghost pressed into the service of a political program he would have recognized only partially and questioned considerably. The theory of moral sentiments remained, through all of this, largely unread. The missing half of the argument waited, patient and quiet, on its shelf. Chapter 17. Who was Adam Smith, really? Let us start with something simple, something most people do not know. Adam Smith never used the word capitalism, not once, not in The Wealth of Nations, not in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, not in any letter, any lecture, any fragment that survived the fire at Panmure House. The word did not exist in his lifetime. It would not appear in the English language until 1854, 64 years after his death. The man the entire world calls the father of capitalism lived and died without ever hearing the word. This is not a small thing. This is the whole thing, because the system that was later named capitalism and then handed back to Smith, as if he had personally designed and approved it, was something narrower and harder and far less morally concerned than anything he actually wrote. Smith had called his subject political economy, the science of the statesman, the study of what makes nations genuinely wealthy, not just rich on paper, but truly, sustainably, humanly well off. He was not writing a manual for businessmen. He was writing an argument for legislators, for people with the power to arrange society in ways that helped ordinary people live decent lives. That is not capitalism. That is moral philosophy with its sleeves rolled up. So how did we get from there to here? How did a quiet, careful, deeply moral Scottish philosopher, a man who never married, who lived with his mother, who burned his unfinished work rather than release something imperfect, become the intellectual symbol of a political movement that celebrates exactly the kind of unchecked merchant power he spent his career warning against? The answer is simple. The complicated parts of Adam Smith were forgotten. And the forgetting was not an accident. For most of the 19th century, both of Smith's books were at least on the table. Economists argued with him. Philosophers engaged with him. Even Karl Marx, who disagreed with nearly everything Smith stood for politically, read him carefully and argued with him directly. The full Smith, complicated and morally rich, was still visible. Then came the Cold War, and simple stories became necessary. The confrontation between Western capitalism and Soviet communism needed clear intellectual weapons. Central planning had its story. The state controls the economy and directs it toward the common good. The opposing story needed to be equally clean, equally simple, equally powerful. Markets are free. Individuals pursue their own interests. Everything works out. And who better to give that story its historical weight than the man who had written about markets and self-interest 200 years earlier? The problem was that Smith had not written a simple story, so the simple story was written for him. Paul Samuelson's economics textbook, published in 1948, used in universities across the Western world for decades, took the invisible hand and placed it at the very center of market theory, presented it as Smith's great discovery, his defining idea, the insight that explained everything. What the textbook did not explain was that the phrase appeared exactly once in the entire Wealth of Nations. That Smith had used it in a specific, narrow argument about why domestic investors tend to prefer local markets. That it was never meant to be a general law of market behavior. That serious economists had debated for generations what it actually meant. None of that fit the simple story. So none of that made it into the textbook. Milton Friedman went further. In his books, his television programs, his enormously influential public arguments, he built an entire vision of capitalism on Smith's name. Leaner, harder, and more absolute than anything Smith had written. The warnings about merchant dishonesty disappeared. The support for public education disappeared. The arguments for progressive taxation disappeared. The passages where Smith wrote that workers under extreme division of labor became as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human being to become, and that this was a catastrophe requiring public remedy, disappeared entirely. What remained was a Smith stripped down to a slogan: the prophet of self-interest, the enemy of government, the man who had proven 2 centuries in advance that greed was not just acceptable but necessary. By the time politicians were wearing Adam Smith neckties and invoking his name in budget speeches, the transformation was complete. The complicated thinker had become a comfortable icon. The moral philosopher had become a brand. But here is what is remarkable. The real Smith never actually went away. He was always there, in both books, on the shelf, waiting. And beginning in the late 20th century, scholars started going back. Historians and philosophers and economists who had read both books, not just the famous one, but both of them, and noticed the gap. The vast, embarrassing, impossible to ignore gap between what Smith actually wrote and what the world had decided he meant. What they found changed everything. The real Adam Smith believed that markets only work when people trust each other. Not as a nice idea, as a structural fact. Take away honesty, take away fair dealing, take away the basic human capacity to care about the consequences of your actions on others. And the market does not produce prosperity. It produces exploitation dressed up as prosperity. It produces a system where the powerful get richer and the ordinary person pays the price, and nobody can quite explain why the invisible hand seems to be picking pockets rather than filling them. The real Adam Smith was deeply, specifically, repeatedly suspicious of big business. He wrote that merchants and manufacturers had a natural tendency to conspire against the public, to lobby governments, to arrange the rules of commerce in their own favor while pretending to act in the national interest. He said their interests were never exactly the same as the interests of the nation. He warned legislators, directly and plainly, never to trust a proposal that came from this group without examining it with the most suspicious attention. These are not vague criticisms. They are precise warnings, and they are in the Wealth of Nations, the book that was supposed to be a celebration of free markets. The real Adam Smith supported public education as a structural necessity, not charity, not kindness, a requirement. An uneducated population was not just morally troubling, it was economically dangerous. Ignorant workers were unproductive workers, and ignorant citizens were vulnerable citizens, easily manipulated by exactly the kind of powerful interests Smith had spent his career describing. The real Adam Smith measured the health of an economy by the condition of its poorest workers. He wrote that no society can be flourishing and happy if the greater part of its members are poor and miserable. He wrote that the wages of the lowest workers were the most important indicator of national prosperity. Not the profits of merchants, not the accumulation of gold, the wages of the people doing the actual work. He never separated his economics from his moral philosophy, not for a single page. The theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations were always one argument in two parts. The first asked, what makes human beings capable of caring for each other? The second asked, what kind of economic world allows them to actually do it? You cannot read the second book honestly without the first. Smith knew this. He said so. He spent 30 years revising both books in parallel, keeping them in conversation, making sure they held together as a system. He called himself a philosopher, a moral philosopher, a man trying to understand what human beings owed each other and what kind of institutions made it possible to pay that debt. That was always the project. From Kirkcaldy to Glasgow to Oxford to Edinburgh to Paris, and back to the house on the shore, from the boy watching the nail-makers to the old man burning his papers in a fireplace at Panmure House. One project, one question, asked with extraordinary patience and extraordinary care across an entire lifetime. What do we owe each other, and what kind of world makes it possible to pay what we owe? He never fully answered it. The third book burned. The jurisprudence, the theory of justice that would have completed the system, went into the fire because he could not make it good enough. He died, by his own account, wishing he had done more. But what he left behind is enough, more than enough. There is a particular kind of light on Scotland's eastern coast in the early morning, gray and clean and honest. The kind of light that shows you things as they are, rather than as you would like them to be. Adam Smith grew up in that light. He returned to it again and again across his life. He did his best work in it, in his mother's house, with the Firth of Forth visible from the garden, in the quiet that only comes when the world has stopped demanding things from you. He was not a symbol. He was not a slogan. He was not a face on a necktie or a name dropped in a budget debate. He was a man who watched the world carefully for a very long time and tried to describe honestly what he saw. He saw that people are not purely selfish. He saw that markets require morality to function. He saw that power corrupts commerce just as reliably as it corrupts everything else. He saw that the measure of a good society is not how wealthy its wealthiest citizens are, but how well its most ordinary ones live. He saw all of this. He wrote all of this. He left it on the shelf for anyone willing to read it whole. Rest now. The questions can wait until morning. Adam Smith spent his life asking them and never stopped believing they were worth asking, which is perhaps the most important thing he ever taught. Sweet dreams, and we'll meet again soon for another story.